Despite what you may have heard, AI teams are not human teams, and we shouldn't think of them that way. I wanted to make an extended video focused on this claim. It's been an intuition that I've had really since the emergence of lane chain and quote unquote agentic systems, and I wanted to elaborate on that intuition, try to develop my own thoughts about it to a sharper degree, and develop the arguments for why I maintain this opinion and what I think some ramifications are for agentic orchestration. I guess the thesis statement is human organizations optimize for human cognitive capabilities and limitations, at least in theory, sometimes in an ideal world. Shouldn't we expect AI teams and organizations to optimize for machine criteria, machine optima, not human criteria? So in the following, I elaborate um, in each kind of miniature section. I first make a observation or a generalization, refine it a little bit. Then I use that generalization to kind of speak to what I see in the human organization as a metaphor for machine organizations that's not serving us very well. And then thoughts that are tentative on what that metaphor should maybe be replaced with, what the organizing principle should be for AI agent teams or machine teams. Um, so I hope you enjoy. Um, I think this is into kind of like broad chapters. The first chapter is really around specialization, and the second chapter is around collaboration. And so I'm going to go into ways in which agentic specialization isn't really like human specialization, or to phrase it a different way, um, ways in which AI doesn't have the same kinds of specialization that humans do. And then I'll go into a separate section on collaboration as well. And part of these observations are kind of based on my former background as a cognitive scientist and just knowing a set of things about how humans tend to perceive the world and how humans tend to reason through the world. And in my current career around AI, seeing ways in which AIs are not the same. And I am not making a stance on the superiority or inferiority of either. There are just aspects of machine intelligence that are distinct from human intelligence. I am not here presupposing that one is better than the other. They are just different in some ways. And so, if we want to optimize machine intelligence, then we ought to adhere to principles that make sense for machine intelligence rather than anthropomorphizing it based on our lens into human intelligence. Without further ado, AI specialization isn't like human specialization. Human specialization overall is very highly determined by knowledge, whereas AI specialization is more determined by problem context. When you really think about it and just look at the research on cognitive science and then look at the research on the relevant research on machine learning, knowledge acquisition is a rate determining fact for human specialization, but not AI specialization. And I think that this is potentially the biggest leakage in the metaphor about how human roles and teams get applied to AIs. Because I'll go into other aspects that are different, but probably not different to the degree that this is different. So let's dive into it. Um, Success of human knowledge acquisition, if you think about it, almost everybody in this audience has gone to school, and we're very familiar with the idea of advancing in a curriculum. You go from subjects that are relatively basic, relatively elementary, and then as a student, start to master those, you go on to more advanced subjects that build on the subjects before. And after a certain point in education, you might start to specialize. You might start to specialize in undergraduate education or graduate education. And as you specialize, you're building on a knowledge base, on a set of facts that um, really kind of comes one right after the other. You don't to the point that as one wants to get to say like PhD level understanding in a field, you have to kind of narrow your specialization. I'm here very specifically talking about knowledge. I am not talking about skill acquisition, which I'll lay out in a separate section. But I'm just talking about um, development of development of predicate knowledge. Um, so as one kind of goes deeper and deeper into a field of study, one has to kind of specialize more and more as a human. Um, we take basic chemistry before organic chemistry. This is not the way that AIs acquire knowledge. Um, to my knowledge, in no commercially available LLM-based AI, is there any significant curriculum-based learning for pre-training. And I think pre-training is constituting most of the knowledge formation for these AIs. There can be exceptions to that statement that are in some post-training steps, but by and large, the knowledge base that AIs have from pre-training doesn't build up in a curriculum like fashion. The AI is developing knowledge about, for example, organic chemistry at the same time that it's developing knowledge about chemistry one, and that acquisition happens simultaneously, at least as far as the training regime goes. It may well be the case that in the course of training, the algorithm, the training regime is starting to develop some knowledge of one subject and then develops into knowledge of a separate subject. But these are not laid out as strictly sequential steps in a learning process. These are laid out, if anything, in pieces of parallelly acquired knowledge. The result of this is that when you inspect a, let's say, beginning 2026 state of the art commercially available AI, and even if you stripped away, say, instruction tuning and other post training steps from it, its pre training knowledge base is going to be comparable to a superset of humans. I, as an individual who studies certain fields, don't are just not going to have access to knowledge that, say, ChatGPT or Gemini has related to fields that I've never studied. Because while human knowledge acquisition tends to be depth first, machine knowledge acquisition tends to be breadth first, if I want to make an overgeneralizing statement. Um, and I think that fact has profound ramifications for how we apply AI and how we specialize AI, and then furthermore, how we organize sets of AI into a team to do effective work. If one of the facts that determines the shape of human organizations and human teams is grouping together individuals into teams with specialized shared knowledge, then that design principle or constraint becomes less relevant when you are trying to organize machine intelligences to do the same thing. So, how much need is there at the end of the day to separate AI roles based on knowledge? I would say that there's not very much for most practical applications. I can see in some applications for, say, deep research agentic teams where you really kind of need to feed a lot of knowledge into a set of agents that you're really trying to specialize to the hilt, and research is the item that comes to mind. Um, I can see where you would need to try to build in a lot of bespoke knowledge into the context windows for each of those agents. Even there, the agents have that knowledge duplicate somewhere in their pre-training condition. Putting it into individual agents' context windows is more, you should think of it more as a heuristic to remind them of knowledge that they have more than knowledge itself. And actually, if you look at studies of the way that prompting LLMs works, it is kind of like there's aspects of it that are similar to a kind of search between the prompt and knowledge that it has from pre-training. There's a rich literature on in-context learning and prompts and what can be developed in terms of knowledge from the prompt versus um, to what extent it's retrieving content from the LLM's deep knowledge base acquired from pre-training. But I don't think we should think of knowledge stuck into context windows as teaching the agent something that it didn't already know to some degree. Um, so I don't think in many applications, certainly the applications in businesses that we could think of where you need to kind of build up this team of agents, I don't think that very many of those use cases, I would say like probably 90% of use cases, you don't really need two highly distinct knowledge that you're giving to each of the agents. Or I think that we might design agentic teams that way because we have a feeling that we should. But I am not sure that those I'm not sure that doing that for those use cases has that much efficacy. Um, so my sense is that outside of deep research, agentic teams, maybe other very, very, very knowledge intensive kinds of tasks that really require deep specialization of a set of agents, I would say that knowledge is not specifically the most effective way to specialize agents with respect to a shared group task that they're doing. If that's knowledge, then the other thing I think of besides knowledge that comes top of mind is skill acquisition. And I think there, as opposed to like knowledge acquisition versus skill acquisition, I think that there's probably like more similarities in machine skill acquisition versus human skill acquisition, but a couple of caveats there. I think one of those caveats is um, the skill acquisition part of AI, and I'm thinking of things like reinforcement learning environments for verifiable rewards, is still a very developing field. And so I'm sure that um, part of what I say will change markedly over the next 6 months, over a year. But I think you could say, as of right now, and I think this has probably been true for at least a couple of years, there's more similarity between machine skill acquisition and human skill acquisition. Um, Training regimes, that being said, training regimes for AI skill acquisition have grown increasingly more specialized. A thing that I noted when I was putting this video together is that with respect, let's take software development, let's take coding as a skill. If you trace through the history of LLM based development, um, the layers in training regimes that are responsible for development of that kind of skill get increasingly more specialized as history has developed. So there was a pre-Chat GPT era of LLMs where you can think of those systems as being almost entirely pre-training. This would be any GPT 1 through 3. There were other systems as well. Those systems were wild and woolly and hard to control, but they were definitely knowledgeable in some interesting ways. And there was attempts to try to press those into service for software engineering. I don't think that they were nearly successful as AIs have been at software engineering in the last year. But as history has unfolded with respect to LLM development, we're seeing we're seeing the development of that skill, or the part of a training regime that's responsible for the development of that skill, kind of go. You can think of it as being higher and higher up in the stack. You could think of it as being more and more specialized. You could think of it as being later and later in the training regime. Because first it kind of went from being the province of what you're trying to do in general pre-training to what you're trying to do in instruction tuning and in other post-training methods. You could say supervised post-training methods. And those steps have some kind of inherent limitations to skill or to scale. If you try to do something like direct preference optimization for LLMs for the purposes of coding, etc., um, one of the seems like a practical challenge. Seems like it's also kind of indicated in the literature is that you can't do something like DPO or ORPO to try to tune the models in too many complex directions at once. So DPO was kind of a little bit of a breakthrough for um, getting models to follow instructions more accurately, getting them to be more human presenting to a certain degree. But it's not necessarily good for, say, a certain kind of complex skill development. And then over kind of like the last year, since really kind of like the DeepSeek moment, we're seeing we're seeing developing coding skill as being more and more the province of reinforcement learning regimes, and that can either be kind of like interspersed with more of an instruction tuning regime. So you go back and forth between instruction tuning and reinforcement learning regimes. That's kind of how DeepSeek did it in the DeepSeek paper. Um, Based on just like a set of anecdotes and observations that I've seen on various kinds of reinforcement learning environments. There's some labs that are likely doing it as just a kind of post training. It's not necessarily interspersed with supervised learning. But in any case, um, we're seeing things like coding development, and this is probably true for math development, and it will probably be true for wider array of skills as we figure out how to subordinate them into this reinforcement learning for explicit feedback regime. Um, as we figure out how to make more and more skill acquisition more amenable to reinforcement learning, it's also probably going to end up being more specialized and therefore more analogous to how humans acquire skills. So although I was kind of dismissive of knowledge acquisition being a constraint that you would form machine teams and machine organizations around, with respect to skill acquisition or skill development, I do think that that's actually the most important right now principle for organizing and specializing teams of agents, and I think it will probably remain so, even increasingly so in the future as um, developments in the field, namely increased context windows, start to mitigate some of the other differences, I think, to a degree. Um, I think the hardest driver for specialization is going to be kind of like skill specialization. And I think it comes together with that um, tool, I'm specifically talking about agentic tools, tool roles and IAM type behavior is also part of that as well. I think one of the takeaways that a lot of practitioners had playing with MCP over the last year has been um, you can't you can't just create a set of agents and then just blow all of their context windows with every MCP tool that you would want to have at their disposal. Um, if anything, you want to try to specialize the different agents based on the set of tools that they have access to, whether that's MCP or whether it's some other protocol. Um, the tools that they have, what they are able to read and write from, um, is, I think, an important specialization principle that will remain important. Um, Part of what we'll talk about in this extended video and video series is the ways in which different agents will communicate with each other. And some of those characteristics, I think, lend to wanting to have a kind of deep specialization based on the set of read and write capabilities that these agents will have. So I would say again to some, um, knowledge specialization amongst various LLMs probably not highly critical for most tasks. Probably as an operating metaphor, way over applied for most tasks. Whereas skill specialization probably important right now and probably becomes increasingly important in the future as some of these other factors start to fall away. Another distinction between kind of how AI cognition works and how human cognition works, and this is definitely true in the here and now, and maybe less true in the future with some developments in the field. But AI task learning, if you can call it that, is not the same as human skill learning in that um, or human task learning, in that the skills that AI has are kind of more or less what you get when you kind of connect to the API. If there's learning, it's learning that's gone on um, under the hood at OpenAI or Anthropic or et cetera before you ever interact with the product. Um, Once you deploy in your environment, they do not learn on the job as such. Um, they definitely do not learn in the sense of I'm Kyle Grove and I'm trying to use an AI to do a particular job. And that instance that I am using directly gets better at the job that I am doing as a result of experience. Part of this will tie into implicit shared state, which we'll talk a little bit more in the collaboration section. But um, what one does with the product at a particular task could be more said to be configuration and when it be said to be learning. Now, a thing that is a possibility in the near term in the sense of it could be happening, but I don't have any direct evidence that it is happening, is that OpenAI and or Anthropic and or Google and or others are getting getting content back from their inference feed and using that as some kind of refinement. This may happen for IDEs for code, but I suspect it does happen for IDEs and code. I suspect the reinforcement learning environments are configured to some extent in that way from live telemetry that they're getting from model inference. But I imagine that that set is very heavily curated. I imagine that um, the operating agreements that these models operate under with their customers um, tends to go against that kind of usage, although I don't think it entirely across the board does. Um, and in general, I don't know that it's accurate to think of that as happening, except in maybe the cases of um, coding IDEs, where I think that they may be doing something like that. I don't think that if one sends a social science question over the wire to OpenAI, that somebody on the back end is using that telemetry to try to make ChatGPT better at that particular realm of social science, for example. I think that IDEs and coding might be the one exception to this. Um, and even there, I'm speculating more than sitting on knowledge that they do this to some degree. So we really shouldn't think of AIs as learning on the job, so to speak, um, either in the sense of the localized sense that we might think of it, or for practical purpose in a generalized sense. This may change at some point down the road. There seems to be enough of an idea of trying to build in a kind of learning loop for this and a need for it. Dwarkesh Patel, who's not an AI researcher but interviews a lot of people in AI and machine learning, has talked about this a little bit. And I think that there may be some attention to this and there may be some work on this that could change this in the future. But a lot of what I would say in 2026 on how to configure agents in teams like this wouldn't rely on the possibility of such a development in the field. Um, so, what does that kind of entail for the human organization operating principle versus the right organizing principle that we would apply to a machine team? It really comes back to um, not really the concept of onboarding, the concept of skill laddering, a lot of concepts that are inherently laden into organizations, ramp up time on a task, things like that, don't really have a place in a team of AI agents. What does make sense in a team of AI agents is configuration and explicit context. So if you think about any time that you've joined a new company and you've taken a new job, uh, you go through a set of onboarding activities and almost everything. Some of that's like getting access to systems, but some of it is some semi-formalized learning, and um, the a lot of times those semi-formalized learnings can be relatively intensive, but they depend to a pretty significant degree on kind of just learning by osmosis. The new human who's in the job kind of sits on the team, sees what other people on the team do, and they act accordingly, even if they haven't been explicitly instructed or formally trained. I think for AIs, we're much more likely to see the right onboarding, if you want to call it that, for AIs, being explicitly spelling out the context for those AIs. A third big difference between, call them machine workers and human workers, is really around attention. And I'm using that word kind of as a little bit of a deliberate pun because obviously attentions and transformer blocks um, is kind of a hot button word to a degree. But I want to call it attention to focus on the ways in which that mechanism works and to compare and to contrast it to human attention. And again, here, this distinction is more subtle than I think the knowledge distinction. You can I don't want to call machine attention working memory because I think that that's a term of art that sits within psychology and cognitive science and is well defined within that context and not well defined when applied to machines. Again, not because of the superiority of either human or machine intelligence. I just think that we should use terms where they are most relevant, most accurate, and most understood by the fields that developed them. But um, there are some, and it's early days on this kind of stuff, but there are some seeming differences in how working memory works as compared to context windows and attention in LLMs. They're both subject to bounds. They both probably have hard upper limits, although different ones. They probably also both suffer some kind of gradual degradation, but again, it's due to somewhat different mechanisms and reasons. Um, but there are some differences. If I want to give you an example to kind of prompt, no pun intended. I want to give an example to kind of prompt what I tend to see as the distinction, um, having used agents to do a lot, LLM based agents to do a lot of things, and also just to help kind of like pump the intuition on what I see them as being good at versus not. Um, if you are, if you're giving, you have a human pupil that you're trying to teach through something, and it's not less of a less of just like a knowledge based field, but more of a field that combines both knowledge and skill. Maybe you're trying to teach a human pupil how to be a better car mechanic. The observation that I have, and this kind of connects to the way that human intelligence is formed versus machine intelligence, is humans tend to work very, very well when you can define for them principles of why something is the way it is. And then that human, I'm generalizing a lot here, by the way. Not all humans necessarily process this kind of information in exactly the same way, but they probably approximate to some degree what I'm saying. Um, if you have a human pupil that you're trying to teach how to be a better car mechanic, elaborating the principles behind why the parts in the car work the way that they do and why various defects in parts in the car lead to various outcomes, the more that you can elaborate into principles, the more the human pupil is able to understand that and kind of systematize it and then kind of deduce from those principles to specific instantiations of of how things should work. Machines, on the other hand, and I don't want to draw too big of a dichotomy here because I think that I definitely think that human cognition has both top down and bottom up processing, and I think machine cognition does as well. But I think that there are important qualitative differences to call out, and that's what I'm trying to do here. A machine, on the other hand, in that same situation, is going to probably do less well if you try to just rely on teaching it the principles of various things. Partially because it does to some degree already have a lot of that in its um, in its training set. But in my experience, and I think this is echoed by a lot of people who have tried to use LLM for complex tasks. The more that you can elaborate different examples, including examples towards edge cases, rules that apply in very specific situations, um, the better off the LLM is going to do. To the point that a few things I would call out here. To the point that like that same human pupil in the automotive setting isn't necessarily going to benefit from the examples. They're going to try to benefit from trying to apply some of the principles that you conveyed to them and trying to apply them into the setting and then test for themselves um, how these principles might work and manifest in the system of the car. These both, of course, would take elements of practice for both the human and the machine. Um, but the human is going to tend to, and again, I'm painting a little bit of a dichotomy, but I'm trying to distill a difference here. The human is going to want to take a principle, try to apply it with a set of predictions, see where those predictions are either adhered to or kind of violated by trial and error, by experiment. The machine is going to want to try to work from the enumerated set of examples that you have and then extrapolate from that. So when one is prompting an LLM, like one's prompting Claude Code or Cursor or whatever, to try to do a task, and I want to give it a big kind of upfront prompt for something that's a relatively complex task, um, it's very, very likely that I spell out, here's the main thing I want you to do, here's kind of a main principle, but here's also like a set of conditions and edge cases and how you should think about them. Um, Part of that probably has to do with knowledge sets of LLMs and humans, but part of it also probably has to do with how we kind of relate to instructors to a degree. I think like one of the themes that's going to be bigger in the collaboration section is that humans tend to need kind of more firsthand experience with things that they're trying to learn about, and they need to develop trust and interpersonal relationships with the folks who are giving them instruction. LLMs don't have those needs, and therefore kind of want is not the right word, but are likely to try to do less independent work, and that's why enumerating the multiple different individual examples of a single principle is more helpful for LLMs than it is for humans. LLMs also have probably more practical bandwidth to be able to deal with that kind of complex task all at once than humans do. I think that um, it's probably the case that for humans, I think this is kind of just borne out by classical working memory research in humans, is that the more humans can break apart problems that they're trying to work on into individual steps, and it is very important for humans to try to keep the elements within each of those individual steps strict. But humans can also kind of go from a bigger task and see the elements that they have to do and plan accordingly so each of the elements slots into each of the individual subtasks. And so the way to, if you have a human that you're trying to, in an experimental setting, for example, get worse performance out of, um, the way to get worse performance out of them is to include distractors that are in the middle of a subtask that they're doing, where the distractors come from some other task that they were working on. There's going to be a similar flavor of this for LLMs, but I think there's a difference to be made as well. For LLMs, the distractors that tend to be problematic, and here I'm just speaking from experience with working with LLMs, the distractors that tend to be problematic are um, when the LLM is working on a task, it's working on its like third software engineering task of the day or something like that. The LLM is probably more prone to conflate an environment or a directory or a other element of a task from a previous step into the current one. I will say that even compared against expert programmers, they're probably more prone to do that than human programmers at this point. Why I think that is the case, it again comes around to findings around how working memory works in humans. Um, Working memory is very heavily skill conditioned in humans. And so there's a classical study of working memory for humans where um, the study asks humans to memorize chessboards, memorize pieces that are arranged on a chessboard. And the finding and they did this for both chess experts as well as chess novices, and they did this for both quote unquote meaningless board positions as well as like meaningful classical positions that you were very likely to see on a chessboard. And the finding that they found many years ago was that chess experts have far superior memory to chess novices for these board configurations if and only if the pieces were in a quote meaningful position. If you had pieces in an illegal position of some sort, etc., or you had pieces that were in positions that would just never occur in an actual chess game, then chess experts and novices performed equivalent to each other in this memory task. I bring that up because it's my suspicion that um, this would not obtain the same way for machines for AIs, and that in fact um, the the machine can like kind of declaratively like remember. I mean, there's all the number of reasons in the world to think this is the case. The machine can just kind of like memorize like this configuration versus that configuration, and it's not trying to contextualize it through quote unquote meaning. The Another way of phrasing that is that human memory of the working memory type tends to be very kind of compression focused, and we compress around signal, whereas for machines, it's more for machine intelligence. It's more around the principle of how clean is the context. If a machine is working with a context window where there's where the context mostly suggests one fact, but then there are parts of that context that suggest a different fact or just extraneous, etc. Machines, this is attested in the research, machines actually tend to be less robust to this than humans. Um, so that is all to say that humans probably have much less, a smaller upper bound on memory, but we have really good ways of compressing signal into something that we can recall when there is a meaning or a signal that we can kind of hang around what we are perceiving. Whereas machines, I keep saying machines, but like when AIs have far superior ability to do recall, what you would call a needle retrieval task in LLM based research. But their ability to synthesize from that can be hampered when the stuff that's in the context window starts to be discrepant. So um, I think these are. I thank you for kind of going with me for this little bit of a digression that I don't think was quite a ramble, but I was trying to tease out some important subtleties between the ways that humans attend to things and the way that AIs attend to things, attend to tasks. And if we think about attention as being a key limiting factor and shaping factor on organizations, then something that's very, very, very gating for humans, which is our attention span, and the main strategy that we use to deal with that, which is signal based compression. We ought not to think about it the same way if we're designing a machine organization or a machine team from scratch because they have both different capabilities as well as different compensation strategies. The next thing I want to kind of broach into, and this doesn't need to be near as elaborate as the previous section, is machine stances are different than human stances. Machine stance taking is different than human stance taking. I think it's pretty well known to a lot of people, both from the research but just anecdotal experience with AIs. AIs are syncophatic, probably problematically so. They just tend to agree with their interlocutor, the person who's giving them queries, and AIs don't really AIs are definitely trained to try to be more agreeable to humans and try to be more helpful to humans, but AIs don't have any particular training step, nor do they have any particular algorithmic bias that I can think of to try to make them hold a stance and then just kind of stick to a stance. And um, we've all dealt with humans that are kind of heavily embedded in stances, but even the most even-minded humans can be kind of blinded by a stance that they take and kind of impermeable to changing their minds to some other stance. And then if you think about the level of machinery that sits in a corporation for brokering disputes, arbitrating disputes, um, reconciling people's stances, aligning individuals, um, a lot of that seems just kind of superfluous to like what the needs of AI are in order to do a task. They don't, AIs, these LLM based AIs in their current instantiation, they don't really, they don't really form hard stances. They don't really like tend to stick to those stances. It's probably on net for some applications. It's probably bad. In this case, it might be useful because there's much less inter AI friction than there will ever be in a human organization. Um, there's probably like an efficacious amount of stance taking we could and should add to machines, but like to try to take mechanisms for conflict resolution and try to apply them to AIs, I think is a lot of anthropomorphism. It's part of why I kind of think patterns of supervisor AIs and individual reportee AIs are a little bit weird and a little bit silly. There's not really disputes to settle. There can be disagreement between AIs on a given stance, but um, in the human organization, if person A and person B don't have the same viewpoint and you make a controversial decision, you still have to work with person A and person B later. In the machine team, if agent A and agent B have different outputs, I don't want to say beliefs. I'm not that hard of an AI skeptic, but it's weird to say AIs have beliefs still. But if agent A and agent B have different statements, and you take a hard decision based on that, um, You just do the next task with agent A and agent B. They won't hold a grudge against you, which is probably a good thing on that. Um, so yeah, I don't think that most conflict resolution type machinery that you see in corporations has any kind of real place in an agentic team. And honestly, you might even need something that creates a little bit more disagreement between AIs because, as I said up top, around knowledge, there's not a lot of specialization. Around skill, there's emerging specialization, but it's not yet culminated. So if anything, the error state that you can fall into is that all of your AIs tend to land incorrectly on the same position when you might need something that prompts them to take a little bit more of a committee point of view that can be a little bit discrepant and hold stance a little bit more. Finally, machine biases are different than human biases. Um, Machines suffer from algorithmic biases due to examples and correlations in their aggregate data set, whereas humans do so in what I would call our anecdotal data sets. So I have a life history that's led me, I'm sure, to certain biases of some form. And then there are other biases that are closer to cognitive universal. And those biases relate in some degree to things like ego formation, et cetera. I will say that I tend to suspect that factors that are due to ego formation in individual humans probably don't have much of an analog in current AIs. So I think that there's various aspects of human corporations that we can say are explicitly or otherwise dedicated to ego management, career management, and career laddering. Um, and they end up being kind of superfluous when applied to AIs, partially because at present AIs are rightless workers, however you feel about that. And they have no ego that we know of to manage. They have no career that we know of to manage. And um, they don't really have like a sense of seniority that we have to manage. You could have AIs that are like more advanced than others, and there are certainly like fleets of AIs where people put more complex, more expensive AIs in some sort of configuration with less expensive, less advanced AIs in order to solve a problem while optimizing budget. But by and large, there's not an idea of seniority that we have to manage. I would even go so far as to say that, like in a team that's purely of AIs, um, there's not a lot of sound organizing principle around hierarchy of agents. Again, if your agents aren't specialized by knowledge really, and maybe they're specialized by skill, but in the sense of hierarchy or the sense of authority, I think of something that sits higher up in the hierarchy being able to countermand or redact in some way something that lower down in the hierarchy has done. And you can certainly have AIs that summarize the work of AIs that are quote lower in a hierarchy in some way. And like maybe you want to trust that with authority, maybe you don't. But I don't think that there's any special wisdom to that, is what I would say. Again, because I don't think that current AIs are meaningfully specialized in that some way. I could have picked much the same instantiation of an agent and made it the summarizing agent. That is different from human hierarchies and organizations that I am familiar with and how they work. Um, but I would say in this space as well, like the takeaway organized principle is probably the biggest unknown of these several. I think there's some very obvious things that could be done differently for machine teams that are kind of like co-opted from human organizations that I just think are kind of irrelevant. And it's kind of clear how you could do things differently. Here, I think that this is a little bit less of a known field, and so the organizing principle is a little bit less clear. Um, Perhaps as specialization amongst LLM-based agents kind of flourishes, then we'll have a better sense of like the organizing principle around how to organize teams of agents. So yeah, I'd say again like 5 facts around specialization of AIs and how they're different from the corresponding facts in humans. AIs don't really specialize in knowledge in the way that humans do, not at all. I think that's the starkest difference. Um, AIs are maybe starting to get more specialized in skill, closer to how humans specialize in skill, but those are still differences that are evolving, and things remain to be seen about that. The third dimension of difference is the way in which humans benefit from attention and the way that machines benefit from attention is different. Humans humans benefit from being able to compress within signal, and they benefit from being able to abstract. Machines tend to benefit more from contextualizing through example. And in an organization that would be built around machines, we'd want to optimize for that. Um, Human machine stances are different than human stances to the point that I would say current machines don't have stances, and that's both a bug and a feature, I'd say, in current LLM based agents. But the fact of how to organize organizations around machines is made easier by the fact that machines don't really take stances. And machine biases are different than human biases. And um, while we have human parts of human organizations that try to mitigate human bias based on learnings from human psychology and HR, um, we don't really have we don't really have an established science of machine psychology, let alone machine industrial psychology, to really be able to formulate an organizing principle around this. In the second part, I want to talk about how AI collaboration isn't like human collaboration. Um, and this wasn't as immediately obvious to me because just thinking about, when I think through again with my background in cognitive science, and I think through and not really, by the way, having a background in uh, industrial psychology or organizational psychology, but when I thought through this a little bit, and with a little bit of help from LLMs, I own the content that's in this video. But for some parts, and especially this latter part, I did ask LLMs a little bit more to kind of elaborate on some examples. Um, but AI collaboration isn't like human collaboration, partially because human collaboration is mediated so heavily by relationships, um, to the point that, like, for a set of things about how humans collaborate together on a work task, if you thought of face preservation and trust building and et cetera as prerequisite to successful work on the task, I would say that that's pretty close to a correct statement. Whereas AIs don't have face saving needs, they don't have trust building needs, and they don't source information by trust, at least in the way that we're familiar with the concept. So AI collaboration isn't mediated by interpersonal needs overall. AIs lack the notion of interpersonal trust, and they don't transact on or seem to maintain interpersonal trust, apart from the human interlocutors they interface with or anybody else that they're trying to, who's querying them. Apart from some training that they have to be able to interface with those, they are not trying to maintain. They do not have as a goal set that we can identify maintaining or developing interpersonal relationships. They want to please the person who's querying them. That is different than trying to maintain or develop relationships over time. As a result of those differences, we could say human collaboration is gated by meetings, shared attention, persuasion, and trust building. Again, um, getting to successful collaborative work product seems to rely very heavily on first developing and maintaining and building requisite trust, aligning, and shared implicit understanding with the other people that you work with. Whereas for AIs, they don't really have those needs, nor do they optimize for those needs. And so AI collaboration is much more, I think it's much more reduced to trying to share state optimally, trying to maintain context, you call it context hygiene, and trying to maintain kind of like the system of record, um, to develop explicit input outputs. And I think of the products as being in the form of schema, specs, acceptance criteria, constraints, things that are all formal outputs in text, legible work. I think I made in a separate video this kind of distinction between legible work and illegible work in human staffed organizations, and why it interacts with AI in certain ways. And um, part of that illegible work that doesn't really sit in an official system of record or a source system, um, part of that illegible work is kind of around this trust building and kind of implicit shared understanding. And it's just seems to be a principle about how humans work with each other in workplaces. Machines don't really do that in that way. For machines, you tend to need to make the implicit explicit. And if they're communicating, it's to share explicit information with each other. And the closer that you can get to explicit state that's transacted back and forth immutably, That's kind of like the machine's version of um, implicit understanding, because that's just related to the ways in which their kind of cognition works. AI communication has different purposes than human workplace communication. Again, kind of very very kind of focused on this concept of trust maintenance, trust building, um, and kind of bootstrapping shared understanding as being kind of artifacts about how humans do work and how humans do communication. Um, we already talked about how machines don't really form stances, and so for a machine-based team, there's much less work that needs to be done for viewpoint development and sharing. Um, whip up a whip up a structured interface contract and do some structured input output, and you can probably call it a day for a lot of machine communication. Whereas humans, we tend to do a lot of work with fuzzy language. Um, I have spent on a lot of teams that I've worked on trying to get things to be as explicit and as much in text as we can. Um, Probably didn't make me the most popular teammate or manager in the places I worked, but I thought it was important for getting work tasks done effectively. Is also probably, I think, needed in order in some ways to make things a more equitable workplace. Um, and that is, again, that's not to say that like human ways of working versus machine ways of working, one is better than the other. But if what we're trying to do is to optimize AI work, then optimizing AI communication for the purpose of work, you don't really need to do much to convince AI or have AIs convince each other to take viewpoints. They already take the viewpoints of their interlocutors to a large and alarming degree. Um, so you want their inner communication to just be more structured, more transactional, and more directly related to work artifacts. Third big principle in how AIs collaborate. This is kind of the obvious one. This is probably the reason why we're all here. AI work allocation is much more amenable to task parallelism than human work allocation. Two reasons for this. Partially, I spoke to this a little bit upstairs. AIs are spot instances of rightless workers, how everyone feels about that, and not a fixed set of humans who have rights and needs and goals. That's one reason. But the other reason is that because of all the factors related to AI knowledge that I stated up above, um, AIs are much more free than to work in parallel because you need to do much less work to equip each of them with relevant knowledge sets. If you think about if you've managed people before and you've managed AIs before, if you think about how much work you as a manager do to equip the people on your staff with individual bits of knowledge, and you think about AIs working from a much more shared knowledge state, then you kind of see this part of the task of management starting to go away a little bit. Um, and as a result, you tend to be able to see the affordance for much more parallelism with respect to task. So if that's on the how much can we effectively spin up parallelism because it's less context dependent, um, and we can kind of allocate it in a almost a map reduced style kind of way. The fact that we can also spin up the instances of agents to go do it all in parallel means that um, with AI agents, they are just much more amenable to task parallelism to the point that in a human organization where you have folks who explicitly have to manage task bandwidth, I think that is going to start to change very radically. I think right now with where things are at in AI, um, we're kind of in this intermediate state where we don't have enough sophistication to really achieve this aforementioned task parallelism. I hear about, people spinning up 20 instances of Claude code, of course. I do that to some limited degree, but I, in my own work, tend to be um, much more sequential to that. So I am probably the um, kind of like rate determining factor on parallelism in that regard for my work. I am a little bit skeptical that folks are getting effective work done out of those like call 20 instances of Claude code and like, do it all at once. I'm a little bit skeptical of that. I also will back that skepticism by saying If you look at like the fleet of AI agent tools that tend to be kind of that PR based, GitHub oriented kind of tools, and I'm thinking of like OpenAI Codex, but I'm also thinking of Google Jules, which nobody has heard about in 6 months, I guess. Um, if you think about tools like that, I think GitHub has a tool that I've never used as well. Um, they seem to have a place, but they don't seem to have as much traction as people wanting to be a little bit hands on keyboard for managing agents. And that's going to be kind of an implicit friction on AI agent parallelism. That being said, I would still say like um, the amount of parallelism, even with that gating that I can get to relative to here's a team of humans, it's too big of a difference to even make useful comparisons between them. And I think that again, like with product innovations as well as technical innovations, we'll get to more and more effective agent parallel bandwidth. And I think that um, strictly allocating task bandwidth is going to very, very soon become a thing of the past. So, yeah, I would say that AI work allocation being much more amenable to task parallelism is a third important shaping constraint on how AIs collaborate that's distinct from what you would think about working from human organizations. So, to sum that section, when we're talking about AI collaboration, it's not mediated by interpersonal needs. It's not mediated by interpersonal trust or transacting or developing trust. It is not mediated by mutual shared understanding so much as explicit transactional communication. Um, it can lean increasingly more towards structure and more towards legible official systems than humans can. And it's more amenable to task parallelism than human organizations and humans are organized around. To sum up the larger video in a whole, the fact that relative to humans, AIs share so much knowledge state and kind of develop knowledge broad rather than deep um, is a big kind of broken metaphor when we try to apply human principles of teamwork to machines or human principles of organization to machines and other aspects of how machines agents work, more subtle, but also lead to important differences in how to organize machines. So that if you take anything away from this video, I want you to take away that when someone is making kind of claims of here's an AI that is going to do blank this person's specific job um, or this specific job role, I think we should be a little bit skeptical of that claim, which is kind of amusing because I'm also like building such a kind of thing, but um, what I want you to take away from this video more than anything else is the kinds of organizational principles that we'll see for kind of like machine teams. You don't have any reason to expect that they have any strict similarity to the principles about how human organizations are built up. There are certain things that are going to be in common, but I think that there are going to be like net new patterns that emerge for development of AI teams that don't really have any sort of correspondence into human teams. So yeah, if you like this kind of content, follow the channel, subscribe. I really greatly appreciate any and all support, and be well. Bye for now.